thanks. Thanks for having me. I thought what I'd start with is just a quick, we have about a 5-minute video that we put together last year that really gives a really good feel of sort of what CUPPA is about and what we do. And it has some interviews from some of the homeowners, some of the volunteer days and things like that. And I think it gives you a lot better feel about kind of who we are and what we do rather than just explaining it. And it's just a few minutes, so I'm gonna go ahead and just start with that.
You know, so finally it came true. You know, true dream. But here we've got finally opportunity to buy the house, you know. And for us it's like, you know, American dream, you know. So finally it came true. You know, so we are very thankful, you know, for the people from here, from Highland, from community partners, they did it for us.
A lot of our dreams were wrong, a lot of our plans were ruined, and we had to pick up the pieces and put it back together. And without affordable housing, I don't know where we would be. We found this place, we found affordable housing, we found CPAH, and it made a difference for us.
Community Partners for Affordable Housing is really the only provider of affordable housing that's providing housing in Highland Park and in the southeastern portion of Lake County.
We've provided a way for the people who work in our community to live in our community, a way for our seniors to be able to stay in their community when they've retired and their incomes are diminished and fixed, and a way for our children to be able to come back to the communities they grew up in to raise their own families. This is huge for the continuity, the stability, and the diversity of a community.
We provide affordable housing in 2 ways. We develop new properties, as was the case with Highland Place and Temple Avenue townhomes, and we acquire and rehab existing homes in the community, some of which would have been destined for the wrecking ball. When construction or rehab is complete, using a combination of contractors and volunteers, we make the homes available at an affordable price to local low-income households. We currently have over 40 homes in our inventory. Because we are a land trust, CUPPA's homes remain part of the community stock of affordable homes forever. Each home will serve not only the first low-income family that moves in, but will serve on average approximately 13 different households over the next 100 years. And with the change in the economy and the change in the housing markets, one of our new goals is to try to clean up some of these blighted and foreclosed properties that are really a nuisance to the community, the neighbors, and it turns out to be a real win-win-win situation.
I mean, we're taking it basically a wasting asset, something that is a step ahead of demolition, and turning it into a home that is nice for the neighborhood.
A group like the Community Partners for Affordable Housing can come in, they can bring that house back to life, they can bring a family back to that neighborhood, and they can really benefit the neighbors as well as the community at large.
We have what we call service days, where members of the community come out and help us out in the homes, and they're great. They're all volunteers, and it's a fun day when people come out.
Because when you buy a house like this, the neighbors are thrilled that you're coming in and taking it over and cleaning it up, and they come and they pitch in, and they're really happy that we're here. So whatever work you do today, you will be able to drive your children by, your grandchildren by, your great-grandchildren by, and say there was a low-income family in that house, and I helped.
The spirit of volunteerism is a terrific thing. It just has its own internalized benefits to anybody that does it. Nobody comes to these things hoping to gain anything other than some satisfaction in the work they're doing and helping out fellow members of the community.
It's really fascinating to get involved in these projects. It's a great family experience, obviously, to get your hands dirty, and also to see how it actually works for the neighborhood. You know you're giving back. You know you're helping to save the organization thousands of dollars in construction costs, or they would otherwise have to pay a contractor, and it's making a real difference.
We have an open house at the end of every house once it's finished. The community's welcomed in, all the neighbors and who worked on the house, the family, and just being able to meet them and hear their story, and they're just so grateful and thankful for what CUPPA does, and what everybody does on these work days, putting together the yard, the inside of the house. It's just really a great opportunity.
With the expanding number of units we've been able to develop here in Highland Park, CUPPA's now taking their show on the road and taking the template, the model that they've developed to address the workforce and income and affordable housing needs here in Highland Park to other communities.
I know that the City of Highland Park has served as a national model. I know that Lake County has been looking to us as an opportunity to really broaden our regional reach in terms of affordable housing. And I know that other communities around this country have been looking at what we've been doing. It's something we're very proud of, and it's something that's had a tremendous impact on the community.
We try to work with the communities to look at the strengths and assets and resources that they have to develop an affordable housing plan that meets their specific needs.
Like I said, we had a lot of dreams. Maybe affordable housing gives us back a little of the dignity we lost.
The CPA heard me out, kind of felt my pain and felt what I was going through. And I am so glad I got a chance today. I love it. I wouldn't trade it for nothing in the world.
Every time that I remember the day when Leo came and said, "Hey, we got the apartment. We're gonna move there." I couldn't believe it. I was so happy, so relieved. I was crying. It was such a wonderful experience. I said once that it was like the light at the end of a tunnel, and I think that is exactly the same feeling that I have now.
I can say that I'm rich, not because I've got a money on my account, because I can live here. That's right. And it came true because of the people from the affordable housing.
Is that on your website?
It is on our website, yeah.
I'll just give you a little bit of history of CUPPA and how we got started. And I'm a very casual person, so shout out any questions you have as we go along. I'm perfectly happy to have a conversation as part of the presentation. So the CUPPA was actually initiated by the City of Highland Park, and back in the late 90s, the city was really concerned about the lack of affordable housing in the community. And particularly at that time, the more modest homes were being torn down, and these big McMansions were being built. And the city was really losing diversity in terms of people, and also in terms of the housing stock that was available. And what we always tell people is that our CUPPA's mission is not to make every house in Highland Park affordable. What we're here to do is try to make sure there's a range of housing options for people at different income levels in the community, different situations, different stages in their life, different life circumstances or crises that they have, that there's that range of housing that's available. So the city directed the Housing Commission to develop an affordable housing plan, and they actually worked with the Voorhees Center and the Great Cities Institute to develop that affordable housing plan. And there were 4 key components of that plan, which was adopted about 12 years ago. The first was to create a community land trust, which is what our organization is, and I'll get into that a little bit more and how that works. The second was to adopt an inclusionary housing program. So in Highland Park, if a developer is building 5 or more units, then 20% of those units need to be set aside as affordable housing, which is the only community in the North Shore that has any kind of inclusionary housing program that's that strong. There's some others that are require less affordable units. There are some that are, like in Evanston, there's one, but it's pretty much voluntary, and so it's not very enforceable. So Highland Park's model is very good. The third goal was to develop an affordable housing trust fund to help fund some of these activities, which they also did. That's primarily funded through a tear-down tax, and so in Highland Park, when someone tears down a home, there's a $10,000 tear-down tax, and that goes into an affordable housing trust fund to help fund affordable housing. And that tear-down tax there are a lot of exemptions. So if someone is tearing down their own home and building a new home, there's an exemption if it's the same size. If it's affordable housing, there's an exemption. If it's torn down because of fires or things like that, there are exemptions. So what it really targets is developers who are tearing down these small houses and putting up these big houses at a profit. The tax does not even have to be paid when the house is torn down. It's paid when the building permit fee is paid for the new construction of the replacement units. So it's not really a huge burden on people other than developers who are building new units. And then the last component of the plan was to adopt an employer-assisted housing program, which they did as well. And so the city will actually provide down payment assistance for city employees up to $9,000 per employee, and they will also match dollar for dollar if another employer in Highland Park adopts an employer-assisted housing program. The city will match that dollar for dollar up to $10,000 per buyer. So that's a bit of the history of CUPPA. So we originated in Highland Park, and as we got started and really had some successes under our belt, Highland Park and CUPPA is really was upheld as a model on the North Shore and regionally. And there were other communities that were looking to establish affordable housing programs similar to what the Land Trust was doing. One example is Lake Forest, and so we were meeting with Lake Forest, giving them advice and tips on how to create a community land trust and how to implement some other affordable housing strategies. And the more we got into that conversation, the more we realized that it really didn't make sense for Lake Forest to set up their own community land trust, and that really affordable housing is a regional issue and could best be addressed on a regional level. And there are a lot of economies of scale and a shared infrastructure that makes a lot of sense. And so Lake Forest partnered with CPAH, and so we're doing work there now, and the same with Evanston too. In terms of what we do, which you picked up a little bit on the video, but we do some new construction of both for sale and rental housing. But what we primarily try to do is preserve the existing housing stock. So we'll buy homes, then we'll do a rehab on the home, and we try to do aesthetic kinds of things to make it look nice, but the major focus is really structural, mechanical kinds of things, so roofs, windows, HVAC, insulation, things like that, structural kinds of repairs. And really we like to buy the worst homes possible, because we're providing a double benefit of cleaning up a problem property, improving the housing stock, and then also providing affordable housing for a low-income family. So we buy the house, we do the rehab, we incorporate a lot of environmental efficiency and green components into the rehab. Several of the homes are LEED certified. And that's important both because it's sort of the right thing to do, but also because when you're providing affordable housing for low-income families, anything that you can do to keep the utility costs down for them is really significant. So we buy the home, we rehab the home, and then what the land trust model does is we sell the home to a low-income household, and the nonprofit retains ownership of the underlying land. And that land is what really drives up the cost of housing in expensive communities. The actual house itself is, in Waukegan versus Highland Park, there's no price difference in the actual house. It's really the land value that's driving up the cost of housing. So the nonprofit retains that land, and so instead of, say, a $300,000 house, it becomes maybe a $150,000 house. So instead of a $2,000 a month mortgage payment, it's a $1,000 a month mortgage payment. And then that land is leased to the homeowner through a 99-year renewable ground lease, so they never have to worry about losing control of that land. And then when a home buyer decides to sell their home, they can sell it to another low-income household or back to community partners for affordable housing. And there's a resale formula that's an appraisal-based formula, but essentially what it does is it allows the homeowners to build equity, just like anyone else would build equity in their home as they pay off their loan. And if the home appreciates, they can get some appreciation as well. But that appreciation is capped so that it stays affordable for the next family. So the real beauty of the land trust model is you're not just helping one family, you're creating this infrastructure of affordable housing. That house will always be there as an affordable house for family after family after family. This slide compares home ownership through a land trust model versus traditional home ownership. Owners get a mortgage with a bank, they accumulate equity, the home can be inherited, they pay property taxes, they can make alterations and improvements, and they get all the same kinds of tax benefits that you do on a traditional house. It's different in the sense that they're paying 20 to 65% below the market value for the house. The land trust retains ownership of that land. The resale restrictions limit the amount of appreciation that they can get. And then the other nice thing about the model is that the property taxes are significantly lower. And that's because the resale restrictions effectively lower the value of that house. So they're taxed on what they can sell the house for. So if they buy it for $150,000, they're taxed on $150,000 because that's what they can sell it to the next buyer for. Their property taxes can go up each year, just like everyone else's does, but it always goes up based on what they can actually sell it for, so not the full market value. So those are just some examples of some of the homes that we've done. Some of the benefits of the land trust model is that, one is that it allows low-income households to build some equity and some wealth. We're very, very clear with the home buyers during the information sessions how the program works. We spend a lot of time on the resale formula to make sure they really understand what it all means. And it's a wonderful program. It's been held up as a model. We're really proud of it. But we always tell people it's not necessarily the right program for everyone. If someone can afford to go buy a home on the open market and they think things are the values are going to wildly appreciate, then we say, by all means, financially, you might be better off doing that. Go do that. But the reality is that the people that we're serving are not able to go buy a house on the open market, and they are paying a lot for rents. They're not getting any equity in rents. They're not building any wealth at all. So this is a way that sort of gets the benefits of home ownership at the price and the risk of rental. It's very easy for them to sell the home back. If they want to sell, they don't have to worry about listing it and finding a seller. There are people on our waiting list. They can close within a couple of months. And so it's a very safe way to buy for them. They're not going to get huge appreciations, but they're not going to see huge losses either. And they can always sell it back. The other benefit of the model is that it's very expensive to do affordable housing. So there are subsidies that go into each of these units to make them affordable, and they're big subsidies. And so some affordable housing programs, like maybe down payment assistance or something like that, will help a home buyer buy a home, and then when they sell the home, they'll have to pay back that subsidy. But the problem with that model is that as time goes on, that subsidy that they repay is not big enough to make the home affordable for the next buyer. And so there's new subsidies that are required to keep it affordable. Whereas with the land trust model, there's this subsidy and it stays with the house forever. It's always going to be affordable. It's recycled at each resale. And so it really builds this permanent infrastructure in the community of affordable housing. The other benefit is that a lot of times in the suburbs, it's very difficult to do multifamily. There's not a big stock of multifamily homes or multifamily units in a lot of the suburbs, and there's often not a lot of land available to do multifamily units. And so we're really taking advantage of the existing infrastructure, which is primarily single-family homes that are in the community. We're not dealing with zoning changes and all those kinds of things. This is one of the new construction developments that we did. It was a mix of for sale and rental. It was actually the first LEED Gold certified affordable housing development in the state. And it incorporated a lot of fun features like geothermal heating and cooling and things like that. This picture I want to show you because this is a good example of how the inclusionary housing program works in Highland Park. This was a development that was completed about 6 or 7 years ago. The two doors on the left, those 2 units sold for almost $1 million a piece. The 2 on the right are the affordable units. And with the inclusionary housing program in Highland Park, half of the units have to be affordable for people at 80% of the median income. The other half can be up to 120% of median income. So the higher income threshold units sold for $259. The lower one was $164. And the way the ordinance works is that on the outside, the affordable units need to blend in. They need to look comparable. If you look closely, they're smaller units, but you would never drive by this and say, oh, that's an affordable housing development, or those are affordable units. The interior finishes can be different to some of the contractors or developers. Like this was done by a really good contractor who was supportive of the affordable housing idea, and he said, I'm putting granite countertops in all the other units. It's not worth my time to spec out cheaper countertops on the affordable units, so he put some very nice finishes in these units. Other developers have said, I'm just going to do the bare minimum of what's required. But it's a really good example of how the inclusionary works. The other really nice thing about the inclusionary housing program is that it really encourages affordable housing throughout the community. We try, with the land trust model, we try very hard not to concentrate our units in any given part of the community and to get it throughout the city. But in reality, certain areas are much more expensive than others, and so sometimes it's challenging to get affordable units in some of the more expensive areas, which often are closer to downtown, closer to transit, closer to services. And with inclusionary, it's part of any new development. In terms of working regionally, one of the things that we learned, and I touched on, was that we started, our original name was the Highland Park, Illinois Community Land Trust when the city created us. And as we developed more and got more experience and looked at what other land trusts across the country were doing, we realized that it really made more sense to be working regionally, to be collaborating with multiple communities in the area. And as I mentioned, affordable housing really is a regional issue that can best be addressed on a regional level. And in Highland Park, if there's affordable housing in neighboring Lake Forest, it's a benefit to Highland Park because people who are working in Highland Park can have nearby affordable housing, and so it's really a regional issue. Certainly there are economies of scale working together. There's a lot that's involved with a land trust. We see our role as not only to create affordable housing units, but it's to provide ongoing stewardship and connection and services to the home buyers and the renters to make sure they're successful. So we have a whole range of services that we call stewardship that we do financial literacy classes, home maintenance classes, landscaping classes. We have a match savings program with a local bank, so people can deposit up to $1,000 per year, up to 3 years, and the bank will match that each year for them. There's a revolving loan fund if people need to make repairs on their homes, things like that. Some of the other reasons to work regionally is that on the North Shore, none of the communities in the North Shore are likely to ever have a large enough inventory to be really sustainable. And so there's not this critical mass in any given community. And so working together, you can reach that critical mass. And as an organization, working more regionally, certainly inherently the organization is more stable. And then working regionally, we can provide more and better services. And so we are working in Lake Forest and Evanston now, and hopefully be doing some work in some other communities too. In terms of some of the community benefits, diversity, creating workforce housing, preserving the existing housing stock and neighborhood character, cleaning up the problem of blighted properties, again, creating that permanent infrastructure of affordable housing, promoting live-near-work housing, helping comply with the Illinois Affordable Housing Planning and Appeals Act, where communities are required to have at least 10% of their housing stock as affordable, and if not, to be developing an affordable housing plan to reach that goal. Encouraging workers to live and spend their money in the local economy, and then reusing those subsidies and the cost effectiveness of it. One of the things that's been really interesting working in different communities is that the way that we talk about affordable housing is very specific to the targeted community. One benefit that's not listed here, in Evanston, when we talk about affordable housing, quite frankly, I think that they feel there is a stock of affordable housing, and what really seems to resonate there is cleaning up blighted properties, the economic stimulus of hiring local contractors, and like for instance our work in Evanston now, we're working with local contractors to build their capacity, and those kinds of things are really interesting to Evanston. In Highland Park, when we talk about it, it seems that they're sort of interested in diversity, they're interested in there's a sense that this is affordable housing is the right thing to do. There's sort of a duty, and that's how they tend to think about it and why they're interested in it. In Lake Forest, it's really, when we talk with Lake Forest, it's about serving their local, the people who live and work in the community. I mean, that's their big focus, and so that's what we try to talk with them about. It's very interesting how the different communities, you have to sort of figure out how to get into the communities and what language and what kinds of messaging works in the different communities. And Lake Forest was one community that we started trying to get affordable housing 6 years ago, and it took many years to sort of get in and get something up and running. I literally remember at a city council meeting in Lake Forest, someone stood up and they said, they were against the affordable housing that we were proposing, and they said, if you can't keep poor people out of Lake Forest, where can you keep them out of? I mean, I had been doing affordable housing long enough at that point that I wasn't totally surprised that someone was thinking that, but I was still completely surprised they would stand up in a city council meeting and actually say that, in public. And actually, there's another of my other favorite stories. This was actually a mayor in a suburban community, which I will not name, but he had formerly lived in Evanston, and the affordable housing advocates were at this city council meeting trying to advocate for affordable housing, and he said, I think he was just sort of getting fed up with all the affordable housing talk, and he finally lost his cool, and he stood up, and the advocates were making a point that it's good for diversity, and he stood up and he said, diversity? I don't need diversity. Why do you think I left Evanston? He sort of sat back down. One of the other benefits that really was sort of a surprise to people was just the community engagement. These volunteer days that we have been so great in getting people involved in the community. They walk away feeling energized and wanting to do more. They really understand affordable housing more. When we do affordable housing units, we typically we have these volunteer days. We bring in neighbors and community members and elected officials. We have them work on the house. They're sort of in there doing that, and then at the end of the rehab, we will have everyone come back. They can see the finished house. They can meet the family who's moving in. And it makes it real. A lot of those myths of affordable housing, the biggest challenge of doing affordable housing in the suburbs is sort of the myths of what affordable housing is and who lives there, and they think Cabrini Green and all these kinds of things. And so it really it helps dispel some of those myths and helps change a lot of minds and build some local support. In terms of some of the lessons learned, you know, the demand is certainly there in the suburbs. We have an enormous waiting list, and we can't do enough units for the people who come through the door. There's a lot involved in managing a land trust and affordable housing, between financing and grants and acquisition and construction management and marketing and all the ongoing home buyer services and you know, dealing with property taxes and long-term affordability requirements and the ground lease and resales and all that kind of stuff. You know, as I mentioned, it's really expensive to do affordable housing, especially in a lot of these high-cost areas. So it's really important to protect that subsidy and make sure it's reused in each resale and not just helping one family. You know, everyone's story is complicated. You know, we spend a lot of time with people. There's no one who comes through our door that has sort of a straightforward, simple story. You know, one of the goals that we had in creating the Land Trust program was really to serve people who are living and working in the community. And you know, I would say 95% of the homes are occupied by people who do live and work in the community, and it's a lot of nonprofit staff, teacher assistants, some city employees, retail staff, a lot of people with disabilities, with a lot of we have an enormous amount of single moms who've lost husbands at a very young age, and they needed a way to stay in the community. You know, we talked about the ongoing support and education, the pricing of the units. We need to make sure when we do sell the units, we price them to make sure that it's going to stay affordable for everyone, so not just making it affordable for that first family, but making sure that it'll stay affordable on resale. You know, the other thing is that there's so much turnover with elected officials that we are, you know, constantly having to re-educate, and you can never sort of, like, Highland Park's been very supportive of affordable housing, but we can't take that for granted, and we constantly have to educate and constantly bring people out, and, you know, seeing is believing. We get them to houses as much as possible. That's my contact information. Be happy to answer any questions or.
Janet, I'm going to go ahead and then we'll have the questions flow. Maybe about, you know. I was told I have to sit over here, so. Well, thanks. It's fun to see something happen, actually, after you make a plan. Itai Zalelem, who is my co-director at the Voorhees Center now, we were actually with Patricia Wright, who was the director at the time. I was just sort of a faculty affiliate, and we worked on this plan. And John, I think, were you involved in some of that plan too? Yes? Yeah, that's right. You did all the interviews, so it's good to see you too. But we all were kind of part of this team in Highland Park, which is 26 miles from downtown Chicago. If you know, measure it out in mileage, we knew from going up there back and forth. And we went up there, and they hired us to do this affordable housing plan. And so it's just nice to see an offshoot of it. And the CLT was actually the first in the country, and it's first in the state of Illinois to actually be implemented. So it's exciting also to see what came out of that, and to see Rob and I were talking. We go kind of back even further around some other issues when we were working at Lake County. But so anyway, it's for people who teach planning and who do planning, and students who are going to go out and do planning, when you see something actually, you know, have that long view and be able to see the outcome, and actually see that there's 40 homes that have come out of this.
That's outdated. It's actually about 60 now. So. 60
homes that come out of this. You're very excited just to see that, and that's a big number. A big number for a land trust that young. First of all, I want to point that out. If you know about land trusts are always about expansion. So the goal is the world is the way a lot of people think about it, or at least within the boundaries, but your goal is always really to get more and more. Now, you know, Rob said not every housing unit, but the more you can get in there to find that balance so that you actually hold in perpetuity those housing units to be affordable is the typical goal of a land trust. So it's exciting to see this. Now, it may have been that you were able to actually take advantage of an unfortunate situation called foreclosures. And I want to point that out because I made some notes while you were talking. I had some thoughts beforehand, but I wanted to just sort of highlight some things from the research. The idea of a land trusts have been around for a long time, more from the idea of conservation of land trusts, so hence the word land trust. But they became a tool for affordable housing preservation and production. And, you know, we see this with new construction as well as preserving existing housing, really in the 1990s in the US. It was a strategy to actually do just what Rob was saying, is in perpetuity make housing affordable, not just one time. So we have had a history of programs that make housing affordable one time, and then the person sells it, they make their profit, or you may not, but usually, you know, they may make a little profit in a neighborhood, and then they move on, and that's it. And so, from a public fisc perspective, a public finance perspective, land trusts make a lot of sense. They're appealing across the divide, if you will, conservative or progressive, excuse me, whether you're Republican or Democrat, because they're the idea of really conserving your resources as well. In the United States, when we started seeing the sort of growing gap between what income was doing and what housing prices were doing, land trusts started popping up everywhere as a strategy to get housing built in communities and to preserve it, and this idea of in perpetuity. That was a strategy, whether you were Highland Park or we also helped in Humboldt Park, a very different community, but both HPs. So, Highland Park, everyone said, oh, you're doing land trusts up there, that's so expensive. I said, well, remember, affordable is a relative term, and that's what we see there, right? It's relative to income, median income, so it's maybe a little bit higher cost in Highland Park, but it's still affordable relative to what you see in that area. In Humboldt Park, when we started talking about it, it was also a strategy to offset what they saw was gentrification coming at them at that time. And so their idea with the first community land trust of Chicago was to really get ahead of what could be the loss of affordable housing as gentrification came further and further down Chicago Avenue towards their community. I point that out because you see it as a strategy in many different, it's a tool for many different conditions. What a lot of people didn't think about at the time was that it was also a great strategy to deal with foreclosure for two things. One is it was a way actually not to help clean up the foreclosure problem, which is what I think we heard a little bit, happening in Highland Park and around the country, in fact, to bring units in and get them back online. But also the research came out conveniently right around the time that really the foreclosure situation hit full force, that people in land trusts, because of the connection to the land trust itself, that is, you have a land lease, you have a landlord in that regard, you have a relationship with land trust, and the land trust itself is an organization, usually a nonprofit, was really connected to its homeowners, was able to get ahead and get in with those landlords, with the homeowners, and actually talk to them about their situation to see if they were running into trouble. And what you find is that the foreclosure rates were so low in land trusts compared to the open market. And so I think, then it was that added another, here's another thing we can check off. It just becomes a win-win-win-win-win-win-win, So I think that's something to think about, how Chicago, the idea of a community land trust is an incredible tool. And Highland Park being sort of this leader in setting the stage, people were like, well, that's very interesting, very progressive. And Highland Park was very progressive. I think what struck me when we first talked to the community out there was the people who were hiring us from the community said, we had, for generation after generation, our children could come back after college and find a place to live, and now they can't. And then the discussion about single moms. We interviewed people and, talked to people who are like, well, we got divorced or for whatever reason, want to stay in the community, I can't afford to stay. You talk to I'm never talking to is senior citizen who basically, went through what she had in terms of her monthly, fixed income after she paid rent to live in this little apartment in downtown Highland Park above a store, and then pay for her medication. She, didn't have anything else left. So it's just this sort of, there's an awareness that there was an affordable housing problem that I think Highland Park was out on the front about compared to other communities around there, I'd say, in terms of being a leader, really talking about that. And I think the way you portray it, it's a very diverse conversation around affordable housing. I don't want to go too in the weeds, but we could talk about Winnetka sometime, a very different experience when we were trying to do an affordable housing plan out there. But there was, sort of the discussion. They actually talked about it much in the same terms you were talking about in terms of expanding diversity, about having, sort of options for people. But there was a pushback, and the politics, I think, is really important to think about this. So anyway, I just want to close out saying the land trust is a really interesting tool. It is a tool, though, and it has limitations. And what really makes it work, though, is the kind of innovative things I think that Rob is talking about here to get people engaged in your community. So you can do land trusts and you can start acquiring property and be very quiet in the community. People don't have to know. And sometimes people want that in a community because they're not comfortable yet with the affordable housing sort of angle in these communities. But by being out there and actually having a sign out there and engaging people to come in and be part of the process, what that does is it shows, well, first of all, that people are more comfortable in this community maybe than other communities to do this, but also that you're engaging people, not just the adults, the kids, right? So they're seeing a whole different way of thinking about affordable housing in their community and the needs. And it gets them to relate to the need for affordable housing to the people that they live next door to. So this is also, when this was going on to launch the Highland Park plan and the CLT, was also efforts in Chicago and around the state of Illinois to talk about housing, affordable housing in general, and to sort of remind people that who needs it. So the firefighter picture you showed, that's been on like everybody's, right? Everyone uses that firefighter. I hope he gets paid well. He's probably not even a firefighter, he's probably an actor, but probably gets paid less. But the idea of like relating to your neighbor in need of affordable housing. So teachers and firefighters, the policemen and all, so it's that putting a face on affordability that became really important at that time too. And I think that's what you're literally doing. I mean, Habitat for Humanity's been doing that for a long time, where you get people engaged in sweat equity and you get to know the person who's going to be your neighbor living there. So I think that's great. And that's why I was asking you about the video being online, because people then can see that. What was really beautiful about the video, and I don't know if it's purposeful, but I suspect not, is that it really did show the diversity of people who were living there in the land trust, right? So we saw a range of people there, and it probably reflects truly the diversity in the land trust homes, right?
We have an annual picnic, and it's the best thing in the world, because there's people of all ages and abilities and races and religions, and it's amazing.
And I think Highland Park has historically kind of prided itself, though, of the community. We think of the North Shore basically as a predominantly white, and it is, with the exceptions of Highland Park, Highwood, I would say, and then Evanston and Skokie. If you kind of think about those neighbors, have much more diversity in them in terms of racial and ethnic groups. But the diversity and the ability to promote that. But what's interesting is that a lot of times people look at that, and you mentioned Cabrini Green, having worked for years with Interfaith Housing, which is of the northern suburbs, which is now called Open Communities. The fear of Cabrini Green is very real still, I think, in many communities up there. But the idea of, like, to put it in more general terms, is the fear of outsiders coming in. A lot of people in Highland Park even talked about this, is that it's not that they didn't want to house people from outside, it's more that they recognized that there was a need within the community and a sense of, we're going to put our money into our community, we want to make sure our community gets the benefit first. And I think that this idea of coming to understand who your community is really important when you're doing these kind of things, and really to help people understand, to educate. And in particular, I think there's more awareness now, but we did this study with Open Communities that looked at immigration in the suburbs and how immigrant-rich the suburbs are, both long-term immigrants as well as newer immigrants. And to really understand, so I was thinking, there was the one gentleman speaking, like there are people who are not aware of what a diverse community they're actually probably living in. It may not be so much racially, but at least ethnically you see it. And you come to know it much more, and the affordable housing question raises it. Now, it's not to say that because you're an immigrant or because you're not white that you need affordable housing, but there's a recognition that historically that's been one of probably many barriers that have prevented having diversity in these suburbs. I just have a few more things that I wanted to talk about. I think what was really interesting too in sort of the use of the CLT, the kind of where you find alliances or allegiance for people to support it. I remember distinctly talking with the group that was focused on preservation, and I don't remember what the name of the group was, but this comes up consistently where, how do we preserve housing, and historic preservation, but also recognizing, in this case, there was an area that I remember had more of the kind of the 1950s. Now they're really hot, the mid-century modern ranch style, but they were sort of, they were further away from the lake. They were a smaller community by the highway, and it was an area where people said, this is where we're seeing the McMansion, the tear down, the footprint. It's a small building on a large lot, and it offers up, by zoning, a lot of transformation of that into these big houses. And people thought it was losing the character, but also it was the one area that still had some, relatively speaking, affordable market rate housing. And so, you know, sort of that sort of fine alliance there with the preservationists, so that you have to build these kind of coalitions around these issues. I think that was a really important thing that came out of this in terms of the alliances that were built. I'm trying to think, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about. Oh, I think the regional piece is really interesting too, you going regional. But what's interesting is how this area, and I think this is getting to this discussion more from a perspective of doing affordable housing in suburbs. Suburbs are, you know, can be quite large, but relatively speaking, their ability to solve some of our big social problems like affordable housing, often you find it falls on, or integration, you know, for that matter, often you find that there are one or two communities that are really successful at that to the point where they become the catch-all, you know, for this. So we always think people like, oh, Evanston and Skokie, they think of the diversity there, and that mayor's comment was interesting. But that, from research, and one of my advisors from when I was at Cleveland State wrote a book about this. He talked about suburban integration. And he said, you know, unless every suburb embraces diversity and promoting integration and reducing segregation, you never are really dealing with the problem. You have one or two communities that become responsible for it. So on the North Shore we have, you know, Evanston and Skokie to a certain extent, and Highland Park for going further north. On the west side you have Oak Park, right? You know, people are aware of these communities that have been proactively stating these things and trying to have policies and practices in place for that. But really, you have to look at it more at a regional perspective. Sort of from another perspective, though, it was interesting, and when we were trying to work on an affordable housing plan for Winnetka, one of the things that came out of a focus group was that Winnetka kind of saw, some people in Winnetka, the residents said they saw Evanston as their affordable housing solution. So, you know, you talk to people, they're like, yeah, well, my son, we brought him a condo in Evanston, and, you know, so he's in the region. But, you know, it was a way to engage them and say, well, you're using the region as an affordable housing strategy. How do we start talking more, in making that more concrete, where there's arrangements and you actually start thinking, so you can have your individual, you know, plans and ideas for your community to keep the uniqueness up, as we came to understand the Winnetka way. Is anyone from Winnetka? I don't want to, I'm not insulting. That was what people said to us all the time. You know, there's the Winnetka way. And I'm like, yes, we've come to know. You know, but so every community has their identity, and they want to keep that. And I think that's an interesting challenge in suburbs. You know, the sort of uniqueness of it, but then how do you start to layer over that and think more regionally a strategy to work together so that you can preserve what you have. And I think people are very surprised. One last thing I have to say, people are very surprised that there is actually areas of affordable housing in most of these communities, if not all. We did focus groups a couple years ago with renters and owners looking at this question of diversity and affordable housing in the suburbs, and we showed pictures of affordable housing that exists in most of these communities. And you know, they saw stuff and they said, well, this, you know, it was sort of like, where do you think this is? Is this affordable housing in Chicago, or is this in the suburbs? And you know, it was kind of playing to this idea, you know, well, this looks like the city versus this looks like the suburbs, but all of it was in the suburbs. And these particular suburbs in the North Shore that we were looking at, I think what we have to realize is that, you know, there are communities here because of the age of them, and when they were built, that a lot of them were actually much more diverse than they are. I mean, unfortunately, many of these communities, the teardowns have really decimated what there was, and that's why the sort of progressive position of Highland Park to preserve this one area. Unfortunately, when we were looking at Winnetka, 1/4 of their housing had been torn down and replaced. And a lot of it was along the areas where in history, when we talked to people, they said, oh yeah, that's where the Plummeries lived, and that's where, you know, the people who made your community livable lived, and they couldn't afford to live there anymore. And I think there are a lot of people who still think they can still live there, for one thing, and on the other hand, don't realize that there's actually still some affordable housing stock. If you could preserve it, you would, you know, that would be a solution. So I'm just, you know, offering this up as sort of a, it's not a big strategy that you put in place across every community. It's more how do you tailor it and work together, but you recognize some common goals, and then you develop that tool to work differently in that community relative to the conditions they have. So I'm not sure what else I have to say. I think it's going to be interesting in the next couple of years is with the Appeals Act, because it's called the Affordable Housing Planning and Appeals Act. And many of these communities did go into, because they weren't home rule, actually did develop their affordable housing plans, which were interesting. But seeing how they play out and whether because they were talking to land trust, so I think there's opportunities for you to actually work with them. So it's cool. It's really cool. It's great to see this. So I don't have anything else to say.
You guys go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, Rob, you
okay. Go ahead.
Can you speak a little bit to the financing, loans, syndication, or whatever?
Sure. Yeah. So each project is a little bit different. The sort of standard financing that we use is federal home dollars through HUD. I mentioned the housing trust fund. Highland Park has a housing trust fund. Lake Forest has a housing trust fund. We do private fundraising with individual donations and foundations and that kind of thing. Some fundraisers. We've used the state donation tax credit in Illinois, the IDA's Affordable Housing Trust Funds, energy efficiency grants, things like that.
No bank loans?
Loans? So when we acquire a home for rehab, we'll do a loan for construction financing for that period. And then on the rental units, we sometimes have long-term loans, small long-term loans on the rental units, but they have to be very small for us to be able to keep the rents low.
Yeah, just some general comments. I think you both covered the issue. I think we put some 2 years into the affordable housing plan in Highland.
Yeah.
So, it's very interesting to note the reasons that we have to use language that is attractive to people in those communities was precisely because they were really suspicious of outsiders. And the whole purpose of you mentioned that as you were talking to, create language that would be attractive to them. The reason we do that is because they are not inherently in favor of affordable housing or low-income housing. You are trying to sell it through their own inherent resonance. So that I think that's important. Another point is people miss the meaning of affordable. Affordable for them means low income. But affordable is really income neutral.
Yeah.
It is really what a person pays in proportion to what they're making. So people automatically think that you are talking about bringing public housing residents into the community. So there is something that we cannot miss, which is people are inherently opposed to what they consider outsiders. And that is, I think, what you heard from the in Forest Park.
Yeah, yeah.
The other point is, I think we also need to recognize the role of the state. The genesis of all these affordable housing plan efforts in the suburbs is because the state had that legislation which was forcing people to think and to try and to respond to that, not necessarily to address affordable housing needs. So the state role was very significant. I think another point here is you have to be at the right place at the right time and with the right people. In Highland Park, when this initiative was started, there were people who were from within the community who were willing to give it everything. Even then, it was, it felt like when we were going there as if we were trying to sell something to a community that's not willing to buy it. So if you have people from within the communities that are trying to push within their own systems, that makes it much easier. I think another point I want to mention is, as important as the community land trust is, the inclusionary zoning in Highland Park was actually revolutionary, in the sense that every 5 homes, one of them have to be affordable. 20% is probably not exceptional, but at least going as low as developing 5 units requiring people to have affordability of them. A couple of questions and a suggestion. The question is, what is the impact of this program on housing property values in the region, in Highland Park? That was the pushback. The pushback was, if you do this, it is going to affect our property value. the other pushback was, we don't have enough money to put into this program. So how much is it affecting the resources of those communities? And the suggestion I want to make is, now we have an example on the ground. It will be very important to see the benefits of these kinds of efforts vis-a-vis the perceived costs of these kinds of efforts. We're trying to sell it theoretically and using other communities from elsewhere, in Vermont or some places. But I think now we have this, I think that there is room for doing a significant research that can promote other communities. And also, you know, good-intentioned people in those communities to come and advocate for it. So I think you are in a very good place to do an analysis of the costs and benefits of this. And the questions are impact on property values and impact on public resources.
So in terms of property values, when you talk about doing affordable housing, there's, you know, regardless of the size you're talking about or the neighborhood, you always get, oh, it's, you know, you get opposition about affordable housing, but they never say it's about affordable housing. It's about, you know, decreasing property values, crime, more traffic, you know, all these kinds of things that they sort of hide behind. And you know, my position is, you know, if someone wants to have a debate about whether or not communities should be investing dollars in affordable housing and whether it's good for the public benefit, and whether there should be federal dollars out there for affordable housing, that's a perfectly fine, reasonable debate to have. But the arguments about you know, crime and property values and those kinds of things, there's just absolutely no truth in that whatsoever, and there have been study after study that has shown that. When we show those studies to communities, it doesn't matter that it had no effect on property values in other communities. In my community, it's going to, and I know it's going to, and I don't care that it didn't there, it's going to here. And that's been the response. And so you know, the best way to try to counter that myth is you know, pointing to very local examples that has not impacted property values. And in Highland Park, we're able to do that. And you know, one of the things that the land trust model does very specifically, when we do sell a house to someone, it's sold at the full market value. So if the home appraises at, say, $325,000, the home is technically sold to the buyer for $325,000. And then we'll provide a credit or a subsidy at closing of whatever, $180,000 to get it down to an affordable price. And so the official recorded sale is not affecting neighboring property values whatsoever. So that's an important piece. And then, you know, if anything, especially over the past few years, when we go in and clean up a property, the neighbors are now really happy because we're improving the housing stock. You know, I would say when we first got started, neighbors were very nervous. We did it more quietly. We sort of went in and did our rehab and things. But we've gotten you know, a good enough reputation in Highland Park. We still have to do a lot more to educate people about affordable housing and who we are and what we do. But you know, a lot more people understand, and they've known someone who's had a house next to one of our homes, and they're not afraid of that property value. In fact, a lot of the neighbors now, you know, they come out and they work on the volunteer days, and they come to the open house and bring gifts for the new family and things like that. And so, you know, there's really been no effect on property values. And then in terms of the financing, you know, Highland Park, technically there are no city resources going into this program. We get our funding through grants through a variety of sources. One of those sources is the Housing Trust Fund that's managed by the Housing Commission, and that's financed through this teardown tax. It's not general city funds or anything. It is this teardown tax. And the other important piece is that the land trust was very intentionally structured as an independent nonprofit organization when we got started, so that even those local housing trust fund dollars, those can be leveraged bring a lot of other resources into the community, and the nonprofits is able to access those resources that a unit of local government or a for-profit wouldn't have been able to do. So that's an important piece to leverage those dollars as much as possible.
What percentage of those that are working in the North Shore, low-income workers or moderate-income workers, live in that area?
You know, I don't know an exact percentage.
But are you to say 95% of those that work in the area, so there must be a reverse figure.
Yeah, you know, what I do know is the location of housing and jobs. So there's a real mismatch between where lower priced homes are versus where low to moderate paying jobs are. So in Lake County, the majority of lower paid employments is in the southeastern portion of Lake County, and the majority of the lower priced housing is in northeast or northwest. And so there's this dramatic mismatch between where the jobs are and where the housing is. You might have some more information about kind of percentage of low-income jobs or something, but...
No, but I mean, if you look at like Highland Park, for example, downtown Highland Park has a lot of service sector jobs, right? So, you know, you can go to any, like, you know, I'm thinking the coffee shops and places I've gone to, you know, when I've gone to meetings up there, and you go up there and you're like, the people who are here, working here, can they afford to live here? And probably not at minimum wage, but...
I think it was 80% coming in.
Was it 80% coming in? Yeah, I know we looked at it, and actually, and it included the people who worked for the village. Yeah. I mean, that was the thing that was important up there in that area. The way you start to make connections about affordable needs is the people who work for your village, you know, or for your town or city. But it was, and then you add to it but I think, yeah, it was probably about 80% coming in from far, and if we mapped from far away, we're talking south suburbs, coming all the way up to Highland Park. And so I think that's a really important thing to note. And the question then of, like, I was going to say in Winnetka, we asked the question because the Winnetka residents were wondering, if you work in Winnetka, do you want to live in Winnetka? So actually a survey went out, and have you tried to live in Winnetka? And it was an interesting, I mean, there were about 16, I can't remember how many employees there were, but there were people who, yes, we tried to, you know, we looked at trying to buy here, and we can't afford here to live here or rent here, you know, or buy here. There were others who didn't want to live there necessarily. You can hear like firemen and may have, some communities require you to live in the community, but like the policemen were kind of like, oh, you know, we don't necessarily like to live where we police. So, you know, there's some different perspectives on that, but the teachers, that was the big thing. The teachers, you know, teachers actually were more than UIC professors, couldn't afford to live in those communities. And, you know, so they were saying, you know, it kind of makes sense. We like to live in our community with the kids we're teaching. So I think that's a really, it's a pretty large number when you look at the types of jobs, with the exception of like a Deerfield, which has actually much more manufacturing and kind of higher end, you know, jobs and commercial jobs. But most of the suburbs up there are more like the, you know, the kind of quaint downtowns that have, with the exception of when the finance industry used to be up in some of those neighborhoods, you know, and car dealerships, I guess. And, you know, it's
one more comment on one of your comments about the inclusionary housing program. The one thing that we found really interesting is that the inclusionary housing program and the land trust program work really well together because in a down economy, there's not new development, so there's no units being created under the inclusionary, and we're able to get properties. The land trust is able to acquire properties at lower prices. And then when there's sort of a booming economy in the housing market, it's a lot harder for the land trust to afford to acquire properties, but there are more units being generated with inclusionary, and so it matches up very nicely.
I think the one thing, when we think of it as a toolkit, so you have the, if you think of all the 4 tools that you put up, the land trust, the trust fund, inclusionary housing, inclusionary zoning, and the employer-assisted housing even, those 4 are actually very complementary tools, and they work in different ways, but they can all work together really in nice synchronicity and harmony. If you can get them, again, to align and think about it that way. And I think that was, you know, that plan kind of helped to do that, even though you're often a nonprofit and, you know, they're all being done through different means. Yeah.
Right. And we administer the inclusionary piece, and so people, there's one application and one resale, everything's identical for people, so they can apply one session and application for both of those programs. Sorry.
I'm curious about how the private lenders played into this. Did your participants have trouble accessing mortgages, you know, with increased regulatory scrutiny, increased oversight from bank overseers in the wake of the housing market collapse? do you guys have a loan loss reserve or any other way to mitigate risk for the private lenders?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have what we call participating lenders, and they're sort of lenders that have gone through training on the land trust model, understand the ground lease and the resale formula, and are supporting the land trust. You know, when there's this foreclosure crisis, a lot of lenders sort of stopped doing lending altogether, and so we were really concerned: are people going to be able to get loans? You know, one thing I would say is that our eligibility criteria was back when people were lending to anyone, and you know, crazy housing ratios and debt to income ratios, those kinds of things. We still had much more strict eligibility criteria because we did not want to set anyone up for failure. And so in a lot of cases, the banks kind of came back to where we already were in terms of our limits. But there were lenders that stopped lending altogether. And so we got nervous there for a while. Luckily, we have 3 lenders that we use now. And 3 is a pretty good number for us. But we got down to a point where there was just 1 lender at one point, and we were definitely getting nervous about that. The other thing about the loans is that the nice thing about the land trust model is, so again, how we record the sale. Say it's sold for $325,000, and we provide that $150,000 of credit at closing to get it down to a lower purchase price. That credit, which essentially represents the value of the land, the lender will consider that as equity in the house, and so that waives private mortgage insurance for the buyers, and so that saves them, you know, $100, $125, $150 a month, which is really significant.
One other quick question.
Yeah.
What happens when they pay off the loan?
When they pay off the loan, they have all that equity, and they
pass on the
can.
house to their kids?
Yeah, so they can pass on the house to their kids, or to anyone. They can pass on the house to anyone. If it's someone who's currently living in the house, they can stay in the house, and that's fine. If it's not someone who is a family member who is living in the house with them, they would have to income qualify to stay in the house, and if they don't, then they would just have to sell it back and take that equity.
Do you have to pay a separate tax on the land trust?
No, so that's another good question. So in Lake County, it's a lot easier to deal with the property taxes than in Cook. In Lake, the township assessor assesses each property, and so what we've developed a relationship with the township assessor, with all the township assessors that we are working in, and they have created in their database, they've created a separate neighborhood, and so regardless of where the CLT properties are physically located, they're all in one neighborhood in the tax assessment system. And we meet with them, so they're all flagged that way, and then we meet with them annually to estimate what the resale value would be if someone wanted to sell it back to us at that point, and then they're taxed based on that. In Cook County, because it's all done at the county, you have to do an appeal based on the lower resale value, and so the first time you do that, it's challenging, it's a pain in the butt, but then afterwards it happens routinely each year.
Does the land trust actually pay taxes on their portion of the title?
We do not, no. The property taxes are based on the resale restricted price, and the home buyer pays that whole property tax bill. But again, it's based on, you know, say $160,000, and so instead of maybe a $6,000 tax bill, they're paying maybe a $3,000 tax bill. So that the monthly payments for people and for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance usually are in the $1,000 to $1,200 range, which is, you know, figure that's affordable to someone at 80% of median income, and it's cheaper than renting. You can't, I mean, the rent.
It's cheaper than Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, to find a place to rent in Highland Park, you know, a 3-bedroom unit is probably $1,800 or more.
Well, taxes are relatively pretty high there. I mean,
Yeah.
That's the other thing about it, that's why it's surprising to hear that.
Yeah. You know, the other interesting thing with the property taxes that we really didn't consider is that, you know, so the property taxes are based on that resale restricted price, so it doesn't go up all that much. It can go up a little bit each year if things appreciate, but it doesn't go up that much. As property values came down dramatically in Highland Park, so instead of $1 million house, now it's a $600,000 house. What the city and the county, everyone did is increase their tax rate because they needed to bring in the same amount of revenue. And so with land trust properties, their value didn't go down all that much, but their rates still went up. And so land trust properties, their taxes went up substantially. And hopefully, if property values go back up, that generally that rate will come back down. But it's been a challenge for some people.
So in that vein, have any of your projects harnessed the historic preservation tax credit program?
We have not, no. We should probably look into that more.
Are they even eligible? Because it's a state program where owner-occupied units, if they spend, I think it's 20% of the base value of the structure on renovations, then qualify for an 8-year tax freeze, and then in those extra 4 years or so, they are gradually ratcheted up to property taxes. We have not used that, and we should probably look into that more. It's a good idea. And in Highland Park, if I'm remembering properly, the buildings that apply for demolition permits automatically are reviewed by the Landmarks Commission for eligibility, right? So it seems like that would be a pretty seamless way to qualify if you use the right structures.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
So as Janet mentioned, land trusts have been around for a while now, but I'm wondering if you can comment a little, so one of your major sources is the Home Partnership Program from HUD, which has increasingly become more and more restrictive, right, as it's been under scrutiny and stuff like that. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the compatibility of the land trust model with the federal regulations and guidelines that govern the funding that you receive.
So the land trust model is a little bit different than what HUD is used to, and so HUD's very regimented and everything fits cleanly in the box, and if it doesn't, it's very difficult. I know that we've in Lake County, the staff who administer the home program, they are very supportive of the land trust model, and they've been really good at working with us on ways to interpret the HUD regulations that still fit within our model. There's a National Community Land Trust Network listserv, and there are constantly questions about that. And some communities really struggle with their jurisdiction who are administering home dollars about a variety of things, and it's an ongoing challenge. One example is HUD's got this. For a while, Lake County has really understood that it's not good public policy to concentrate affordable housing in any given community. And so Lake County has been supporting the land trust because they want to see affordable housing throughout Lake County and communities that don't traditionally have a lot of affordable housing. And HUD over the last couple of years has sort of gotten on that bandwagon a little bit too. So they're saying, yes, affordable housing in non-traditionally low-income areas, that's what you should do, that's good public policy, and really pushing communities to do that. At the same time, HUD has these, to do affordable units, HUD has these these limits on how much the home can be appraised for in order to qualify for the HUD the home program. So, for example, HUD says when we acquire a house and we then sell it to someone, it cannot appraise in Lake County more than $267,000. A lot of our homes, the full market value would appraise more than $267,000 just because it's in Highland Park. And so that's an example where some communities are saying, oh, you can't do this because it appraises at $267,000, that's more than the HUD limit. So HUD's saying, do affordable housing in expensive areas, but they're saying, but you can't spend more than that. I mean, in our case, what we have done is, to get around that example, get around that specific case, is that when we report the appraised value, we're reporting the resale restricted appraised value. So essentially taking the land value out. And the county said that makes sense. That's really, that's how the tax assessor assesses it. The county brought that to the field office, HUD's field office in Chicago, and said they said, oh, you're cheating the system, that's not really the full appraised value, and the county pushed back, and they said, well, show me where we can't do that, and so they're sort of letting it go, and you know, other communities haven't necessarily pushed back to HUD and some of those things, but it's definitely a concern.
As I'm listening to all of this, and my background is historic preservation, I think this is really brilliant what you all are doing. My question is, because of the inequity in property taxes and how they fund the schools, which to my mind is actually the foundation for what we're seeing in what you're all dealing with, how do you that are involved in this, how are you interfacing with communities? What are they saying? Is this just being left off the table, or do you see where I'm going?
Yeah.
He's on the ground with us, huh?
Okay.
So, you know, we have about 60 units in Highland, or 60 units total, so maybe 45 in Highland Park. There are about 9,000, 10,000 housing units in Highland Park. And so the percentage of units that are assessed at a lower value compared to the overall number of homes is very small. So it's having a very small impact. You know, in terms of actual financial dollars, it's a very small impact in relation to the number of households. And so that's sort of one thing. You know, the other thing is that there are a lot of other there are senior freezes, there are senior exemptions, there are a lot of other kinds of exemptions and freezes and things, and this is very comparable to something like that are already in place. You know,
and Highland Park is a TIF, if I'm not mistaken, right? Tax Increment Financing District. That was their downtown area.
Yeah.
That so I was going to say, you know, if you can argue. The challenge here is that if, you know, like the city of Chicago is struggling with this, although the current mayor doesn't seem to care. That's my official opinion, but about the fact that how much of our land is in tax increment financing, or in just in our encumbrance, if you will, into the future. But in some communities, they would start to say, we've reached a critical point, maybe, and that's where that sort of tipping point, but 60 out of 10,000 or 9,000 is very small. It's a drop in the bucket effect, but then you start to add these other things. And, you know, so somebody who's watching the public fisc will want to pay attention to those things and sort of see the balance and the weighing them out. But the idea that of these different strategies is that they have benefits and costs and benefits, and sometimes those are fiscal, you know, impacts, and sometimes those are social benefits and social impacts. And so I think that's the other thing about this, is how do you weigh it out and argue it, but also be mindful of, you know, sort of cities have to balance their budgets, and there's different ways they do it, and you know, you don't want to be obligating yourself out in the future and not being able to actually pay your bills. But you know, in terms of, I was trying to think of the only real research that you can look at for a long-term impact is in Burlington, Vermont, which has had a community land trust since for over 40 years now. And they've done a lot of research on it, and I can't think of specific numbers, I can't think of anything they've said specifically about the schools, but given how expansive it is as part of their fabric, I mean, it's just woven in through the whole, you know, the whole town, and there's a lot of units in it, and it's not been, I've never heard any pushback, and I've not heard anything about school quality going down, but I'm just saying that in general, I'd have to go back and look at the research, but that's probably the only place where as a self-contained within its own town, you know, boundaries, that you could look at a land trust and actually raise that question to see, has it impacted over time schools? Now, school financing varies from state to state, so I don't know how, you know, Vermont is compared to Illinois, which, you know, but most of it, if it's tied to property tax, it's the first question people ask. If you are in any way reducing the amount of property taxes coming in, what impact is it going to have on our schools? And also, you know, the typical thing, if you're bringing in families or you're having more families here, which, you know, communities want families, but then they don't want to pay for them. You know, you have to sort of weigh that out too. But, you know, you have to say, well, maybe if there are, you know, if the goal is to have a nice mix of family housing and good schools, you figure out how you make that happen. And if the taxes are being impacted, then you figure out how you find other resources to make sure the schools are good quality.
I mean, to date, the schools, we have a very good relationship with the schools, and they've been very supportive, and you know, they're very happy with, you know, they see struggling kids who are bouncing around from place to place, and you know, they are happy to have the resource there to house some of the kids and some of the staff, and so they see that benefit too, and you know, they really haven't raised the other issue as a concern. Knock on wood, to know. But.
Thank you for that. And my question then, to come in from the other side, would be my fear. My question about my fear would be that it might, do you think could be a consequence where people who are in these, shall we say, perhaps not wealthier, although yes, Winnetka, but that they could get the idea that, well, there really isn't a need to become politically active to have, shall we say, equality with each child in the public school system in this state. In other words, because we can feel good because we're in this community that we have some of this affordable housing, whereas we have a whole part of the city and parts of the state where there are children that are using textbooks that are, well, let's see, I have friends who are teachers, I don't know, 9, 10 years old. The textbooks are 9 or 10 years old. So I guess it's, do you see where it might be?
It's interesting to think about though, because then the movement out in the North Shore around school, about changing the funding structure at the state, I forget the name of the group that formed when they welcomed the kids up from Chicago. It was 2008, and they greeted them at New Church Township as a symbolic gesture. And since then, they've gone on as as sort of an active group to try and change the financing of schools. So they were seeing the connection. What's the name of the group? I know.
I can find out from that thing.
Yeah, but so they're making that connection between they recognize what the benefits they have in their community, and that it's not right to have other communities that don't have those benefits. Now, it's not everyone thinking that way, trust me, but I think that's an interesting thing, you know, and it comes out of organizing, and I think that's when you're talking about sort of the political awareness and activity, these kind of things, you know, there's the day-to-day job of just maintaining a land trust, which is highly, you know, complicated and all that, and then there's the sort of political organizing work that has to go on in these communities to keep that going, and I think that's, to tie that back to your point about mayors come and go and change, and I mean, that's the reason, like, Winnetka's affordable housing plan didn't get passed, was there was a change in leadership during the time the plan was made, changed in the commission, the planning commission, elections were happening in terms of the at-large and city council members. This is the constant environment, and small town politics are huge. So you can turn over things very quickly, and watching that in terms of caucuses, and that's another nature of the way politics are done in these suburbs, I think you need to kind of pay attention to that too. So it's, you know, it's like movements, you have to keep moving, you have to keep vigil, and I think that's how you start to build those alliances and coalitions so that the affordable housing piece, the schools piece, they're all kind of working together is really important. And preservation as well, as we were talking about. So.
Well, thank you so much.